He wasn't supposed to change the war. He wasn't a general, or a scientist, or a man with a wall full of engineering degrees. His name was Papy Gun, a 43-year-old former Navy enlisted man, airline mechanic, and father of 4. Before the war, he spent more time fixing worn-out engines in tropical heat than sitting in any classroom. But what he didn't learn in school, he learned in the sky. And in the Pacific, that kind of man turned out to be far more valuable than anyone expected. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Gunn's entire life shattered. American defenses collapsed, Manila fell, and his wife and 4 children were captured and locked inside the Santo Tomas internment camp, starving, sick, and cut off from the world. Papy Gun didn't fight this war for rank. He fought it because he wanted his family back. But the truth was brutal. America was losing the air war in the Southwest Pacific. Bombers flew high, missed their targets, and died low when they tried to descend. In a single month, 11 A-20 bombers were shot down while barely scratching Japanese convoys. The system was failing. The doctrine was failing. The experts in Washington had theories. Gunn had experience. And that experience led him to one radical idea. If the bombers couldn't hit ships from above, then they needed to go low, dangerously low, so low that the ocean's surface looked like a runway. Skip bombing, forward-firing guns, a bomber rebuilt into a gunship. To the experts, it sounded reckless, even suicidal. To Gunn, it was the only way to survive. He didn't care that they called it impossible. He didn't care that they tried to shut him down. He cared about sinking Japanese ships, protecting American air crews, and carving a path back to Manila, back to the people he loved. And, to do that, he was about to build something the Pacific had never seen before. By mid-1942, the air war in the Southwest Pacific was collapsing under its own weight. American bombers were flying missions the way textbooks told them to: high altitude, tight formations, steady bomb runs. But the Pacific wasn't Europe, and Japanese convoys weren't factories sitting still on land. The bombers were too high, the weather too unpredictable, the ships too fast, and the ocean too wide. From 15,000 feet, a transport ship looked like a gray smudge sliding across a darker gray sea. Pilots dropped their bombs, watched the water erupt in white plumes, and realized none of it mattered. The convoy kept moving. The bombs missed. The mission failed. When crews tried to fly lower, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners ripped them apart. Fresh pilots lasted minutes. Veterans lasted longer, but not long enough. The 5th Air Force was losing aircraft faster than new ones arrived. Pilots whispered that the Pacific didn't kill you quickly. It bled you out, one hopeless mission at a time. And every failed attack meant another Japanese convoy reaching New Guinea with reinforcements, supplies, and fuel that kept the war grinding forward. The system wasn't broken. It had never been designed for this kind of war. The Pacific had almost no radar coverage. Weather changed every hour. Distances stretched pilots and engines to their limits. Jungle-covered mountains forced bombers into narrow approach corridors where Japanese fighters waited. And every time a convoy slipped through, thousands of fresh soldiers poured into the front lines. The war became a cycle. Americans bombed, missed, retreated, and buried their dead. Japan delivered another wave of troops. And the ground campaign grew harder, bloodier, and slower. American commanders knew the truth. The war wouldn't turn until the convoys stopped. And the convoys wouldn't stop until someone found a way to break the rules, to fight the ocean itself, not the theory written in training manuals. That someone was Gunn. He saw what the experts didn't. Ships weren't meant to be attacked from above. They needed to be hit from the side, up close, at eye level, with overwhelming fire. If bombers were going to survive, they had to become predators, not targets. And deep down, Gunn carried a motivation the textbooks could never account for. Every convoy he failed to stop pushed the war further away from Manila. For most people, the answer to a failing strategy is to adjust it. For Papy Gun, the answer was to throw the entire strategy in the trash. He looked at the wrecked A-20s dripping oil on the airstrip. He listened to pilots describe how their bombs splashed harmlessly beside Japanese ships. And he understood something the official manuals never admitted. If you fight a naval convoy from the sky, you can't attack it like a traditional bomber. You need to hit it like a warship. Gunn believed there was only one way to do that, by flying low. Not a few hundred feet low, 15 feet above the water, low enough to feel the ocean spray hit the windshield, low enough that the bow waves of enemy ships caught your eye before their gunners did. At that height, bombs wouldn't fall. They would skip, just like a flat stone flung across a pond. Skip bombing wasn't new in theory, but almost nobody had the courage, or the desperation, to turn it into doctrine. Gunn wanted to turn it into a weapon, but flying that low meant flying straight into a wall of Japanese machine gun fire. And that meant only one thing: the bomber had to shoot first. The standard A-20 bomber carried 4 .30 caliber guns in the nose. Against a steel-hulled transport ship, 30 caliber rounds might as well have been BB pellets. They rattled against armor plates, sparked off railings, and did little more than alert the enemy that an attack was underway. Gunn wanted 50 caliber guns, big, heavy, angry weapons that chewed through steel, through engines, through ammunition lockers, through anything unlucky enough to be on deck. But installing 450s in the nose of a bomber wasn't just unusual, it was against doctrine, against engineering logic, against everything the experts in Washington believed. Too much weight in the nose, too much recoil, too much stress on the airframe, too big a shift in center of gravity, too dangerous for pilots. Every reason they listed only pushed Gunn further. He scavenged 50 caliber machine guns from wrecked P-39s and P-40s, aircraft that would never fly again but still had plenty of fight left in their gun barrels. He built a steel frame inside the nose of an A-20, bolted 4 heavy guns into it, and loaded 200 pounds of ammunition beside them. When the test pilot tried to take off, the A-20 nearly buried its nose in the dirt. The aircraft fought him the entire way. It wanted to pitch down, but it didn't. And once it was in the air, it flew like nothing the Pacific had ever seen. The A-20 was no longer a bomber. It was a blunt instrument, a flying hammerhead built to smash anything in its path. For Gunn, this was only the beginning. If 4 forward-firing 50 caliber guns worked on an A-20, then a bigger aircraft could carry more. 6 guns, 8, 10, maybe more. He wasn't building a bomber anymore. He was building a gunship, a weapon designed to tear open convoys, shred their defenses, and give American crews a fighting chance. To the pilots, Gunn's idea looked like hope. To the engineers thousands of miles away, it looked like madness. They sent warnings, reports, formal objections. They called the concept impractical. Some even used the word suicidal. Gunn didn't respond. He was too busy inventing the next stage of the war. And that next stage would require a bigger machine, one that could carry 14 guns forward, survive long-range missions, and deliver the kind of firepower no bomber on Earth had ever unleashed. It was time for the B-25. The A-20 had proven the idea. Now Gunn needed an aircraft with real range, real payload, and real muscle, something that could not only strike Japanese convoys, but chase them across hundreds of miles of open water. That aircraft was the North American B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was never meant to be a gunship. It was designed as a medium bomber, steady, reliable, adaptable, but not extreme. In the hands of ordinary air crews, it could haul bombs and return home. In the hands of Papy Gun, it became something entirely different. Gunn stripped the bombardier station out of the nose. He removed everything that didn't scream destruction. And into that empty space, he bolted 4 50 caliber machine guns facing dead ahead. 4 guns weren't enough. He added 2 more in external cheek mounts on each side of the fuselage, angled slightly inward so their streams of fire converged at a single, deadly point ahead of the aircraft. 6 guns still weren't enough. Gunn walked around the B-25, stared at the top turret, and realized it didn't have to face backward. He modified the wiring, adjusted the gearing, and rotated it forward, turning the turret into a 7th and 8th forward-firing weapon. 8 guns still weren't enough. He installed 2 more 50s on each side of the fuselage behind the cockpit. Now, the B-25 carried 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, the equivalent of 2 P-51 Mustangs welded to the nose of a bomber. The ground crew looked at the thing and shook their heads. They called it Papy's folly. Some called it a death trap. Others just stared, amazed that a single bomber now had the firepower of an entire fighter squadron. And there was one problem. It flew like a brick with an attitude. The first time Gunn tested it, the B-25 tried to drive itself straight into the ground. The nose was so heavy it required full back pressure just to keep the aircraft level. But once it clawed itself into the air, the monster came alive. The recoil of 14 50 caliber guns didn't knock it off target. The vibrations didn't tear the nose apart. The engines didn't quit. The airframe didn't bend. It held together, and it hit harder than anything that had ever flown in the Pacific. Gunn flew the prototype to Charter's towers to show the third attack group. The moment he landed, the air crews gathered around the aircraft like they were looking at a creature from another world. The Pacific had never seen a bomber like this. No one had. When General George Kenney heard what Gunn had built, he didn't send congratulations, he sent orders. Modify every B-25 we have. And to Kazakhs. The 81st Air Depot Group in Townsville worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, tearing open nose sections, welding reinforcement plates, aligning gun mounts, and turning factory bombers into hand-built killing machines. By February 1943, just months after Gunn's first experiment, 30 fully modified B-25 strafers were ready for combat. And that was when the message arrived from the engineers at Wright Field. Modifications impractical. Balance incorrect. Aircraft unsafe. Recommend grounding all modified B-25s immediately. But while the experts were writing their objections, the war was moving without them, and the monster they feared was already on its way toward the biggest Japanese convoy the Southwest Pacific had seen since the fall of the Philippines. Gunn had built the ultimate low-altitude weapon, and he was about to prove it. At the end of February 1943, a message crackled through Allied code-breaking stations in Melbourne, a message that changed everything. Japanese transports were leaving Rabaul, 8 ships, nearly 7,000 troops, protected by 8 destroyers. Their destination? Lae, on the north coast of New Guinea. If they made it to shore, the ground war would tilt sharply back in Japan's favor. American troops were exhausted, supplies were short, morale was stretched thin. General George Kenney had 72 hours to stop the convoy. But the Japanese were confident. They sailed under cloud cover thick enough to hide mountains. March meant monsoon rains, low visibility, unpredictable winds, and seas rough enough to swallow aircraft whole. On March 2nd, reconnaissance aircraft finally punched through the clouds and spotted the ships, long gray silhouettes slicing through the Vityaz Strait. That sight triggered the most ambitious air assault the Southwest Pacific had ever attempted. Captain Ed Larner briefed the 92nd Bomb Squadron the night before the attack. 12 B-25 strafers, Gunn's monsters, would lead the strike at wave-top height. Behind them, 30 modified A-20 Havocs. Above them, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters for cover. And overhead, P-38 Lightnings to deal with Japanese fighters. It wasn't just an attack plan. It was a trap, coordinated, layered, and timed to the second. B-17s would go in first, high in the clouds, drawing every anti-aircraft gun skyward. The Japanese would look up. They would aim up. And while their eyes were locked on the bombers above, the real killers would be racing in just 50 feet above the water. The room fell silent when the briefing ended at 2200 hours. Every pilot understood what 50 feet meant. One wrong move, and the ocean would claim them. One hit to the engines, and they'd spiral into the sea before they could blink. But every man also understood what failure meant for the ground war, and for the thousands of Americans depending on them. No one slept that night. At 06:30 the next morning, the strike force assembled over Cape Ward Hunt. 137 aircraft, engines shaking the air, pilots gripping their controls, every man staring into a horizon of gray mist. When the B-17s reached the convoy, the Japanese opened up with everything they had. Black bursts of flak filled the sky. Shells exploded in the clouds. Gunners fired wildly at shadows. And that was when the B-25s arrived. Larner led the strafers in from the southeast. Flying so low, the propellers kicked up blades of spray. 14 50 caliber guns per aircraft. 168 guns firing together. To the Japanese lookouts, it must have looked like the ocean itself was erupting. The forward-firing guns raked across decks, cutting down anti-aircraft crews before they could turn their barrels. Transport ships tried to turn, but it was too late. The B-25s didn't slow down. They attacked like predators, tearing through the convoy at the speed of a diving hawk, guns hammering, shells punching into steel. For the first time in the Pacific War, a Japanese convoy didn't just come under attack. It came under erasure, and the work had only just begun. The first ship to die was the Kyokusei Maru. Her lookout spotted the American formation at roughly 2 miles. Low shapes skimming the surface, too fast, too steady, too silent. The captain ordered a hard turn to starboard, a desperate attempt to angle the ship away from the attackers. It didn't matter. The B-25s opened fire at 800 yards. 14 50 caliber guns per aircraft unleashed a storm of metal that walked across the water and climbed the ship's hull like a rising saw blade. The bridge windows shattered. Deck gunners were cut down before they could rotate their weapons. 3 B-25s released their bombs at 100 yards. One skipped off the water, punched through the hull, and detonated inside the engine room. The transport shuddered, listed, and began sinking within minutes. 30 seconds into the attack, the Kyokusei Maru was finished. The next target, the Teiyo Maru, didn't even have that long. Her captain pushed the engines to full speed, but 15 knots meant nothing against B-25s doing over 240. 4 strafers bracketed the ship from both sides, their gun streams converging into a single lethal corridor of fire. A Japanese officer on the bridge took 3 rounds to the chest. The captain died seconds later. Gunners tried to return fire, but their weapons were dead before they could traverse. Bombs struck the hull in rapid succession, 5 hits out of 8 drops. The ship split in half. The ocean swallowed her in 6 minutes. All across the Bismarck Sea, chaos exploded. Smoke columns rose like black pillars. Survivors jumped into the water, weighed down by gear that dragged them under. Boats overturned, torn metal drifted in flames. And the B-25s kept coming. Australian Beaufighters strafed the destroyer Shirakumo, knocking out her forward guns. A-20 Havocs hunted crippled escorts, circling back again and again until their ammunition trays were empty. American P-38s dove on Japanese Zero fighters, climbing from Leh, scattering them before they could reach the convoy. By this point, something unprecedented had already happened. In less than 20 minutes, Gunn's low-level gunships had sunk or fatally crippled 8 Japanese ships, a level of destruction no high-altitude bomber group had ever achieved in the Pacific. The convoy wasn't merely under attack, it was collapsing. At 0900 hours, the Japanese formation no longer resembled a convoy. It was a graveyard. 40 square miles of burning ships, oil slicks, wreckage, and men fighting just to keep their heads above water. But the attack wasn't over. When the second Allied strike arrived at 1400 hours, the skies were clear. The Zeros were on the ground refueling. The convoy had no fighter cover at all. One transport suffered a chain of direct hits that triggered a magazine blast so violent it was reportedly visible from miles away. The ship didn't just sink, it vanished into smoke and spray. Hundreds of soldiers died in an instant. Captain Ed Larner's B-25 roared in low over the Oryoku Maru, the deck already burning in 14 different places. The anti-aircraft guns were silent, their crews gone. Larner released 2 bombs at point-blank range. Both hit. The ship rolled, shuddered, and capsized. The final act of destruction belonged to the destroyer, Asashio, crippled but still afloat. 3 A-20 Havocs spotted her while she was pulling survivors from the water. They attacked from 3 directions, their guns sweeping the deck before bombs smashed through the forward superstructure. The destroyer burned through the night and sank at dawn. By the time the smoke settled, the truth was undeniable. 8 transports, gone. 4 destroyers, gone. Over 3,000 Japanese troops and sailors, dead. The convoy, shattered beyond recovery. Japanese commanders had believed weather would protect them. They believed altitude would shield them. They believed the Americans couldn't strike this hard, this low, or this fast. But they had never faced Gunn's gunships. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a victory. It was a demonstration, a 72-hour transformation of theory into violent reality, proving that low-altitude skip bombing and overwhelming forward firepower could dismantle an entire naval force. General MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating air victories in history. And the monster Papy Gun had built, the bomber the experts tried to shut down, had become the most feared aircraft in the Southwest Pacific. While the waters of the Bismarck Sea were still burning, a message traveled thousands of miles across the Pacific. A message aimed directly at the engineers who had tried to shut Gunn down. In Washington, the experts at Wright Field were preparing a formal report. They had spent days reviewing diagrams and calculations, convinced that Gunn's modifications were unsafe, unbalanced, structurally flawed, and fundamentally incompatible with the B-25's design. And then General George Kenney walked into their meeting. He brought a single piece of news. "Those impossible airplanes you're worried about," he said, "just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy." The room went silent. 12 modified B-25s. The very aircraft the experts insisted were unsafe had just erased a fleet that high-altitude bombers couldn't touch. Every concern, every objection, every warning had been proven meaningless by 3 hours of combat. The engineering principles hadn't changed. Reality had. The engineers asked how the aircraft held together. Kenny explained the truth. Gunn had solved the center of gravity issue by shifting equipment aft. He had answered every problem they had identified, not with paperwork, but with experience and welding torches. They asked for crash reports. There were none. The modified B-25s had survived their first major battle with 0 losses to structural failure. They asked if the pilots complained about handling. Yes, Kenny said. They complained it was too effective. For the first time in the war, theory had bowed to field innovation. The experts weren't angry, they were stunned. And in that moment, they understood something that every combat pilot in the Southwest Pacific already knew. Papy Gun wasn't breaking the rules, he was rewriting them. Within hours, Wright Field issued new instructions. Instead of shutting down Gunn's ideas, they would standardize them. Instead of treating his work as a dangerous anomaly, they would treat it as the future. North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, requested Gunn personally. They wanted his drawings, his measurements, his fixes, his field solutions, his welding patterns, even the way he routed ammunition belts. They wanted every detail of the monster he had created in a dusty Australian workshop with salvaged parts and scavenged guns. The man the experts once dismissed as reckless was now the man they needed most. Factories in California redesigned nose sections, strengthened bulkheads, recalculated balance, rerouted electrical systems, and integrated forward-firing gun packages directly into the production line. They built new B-25 seconds with hardened skin, improved mounts, and internal structures designed specifically for Gunn's tactics. In May 1933, the first factory-built gunship variant rolled out, the B-25G. Then, the B-25H, even deadlier, carrying a 75mm cannon alongside its machine guns. Then the B-25J, the most heavily armed production bomber of the entire war. By the end of the conflict, nearly 5,000 gunship variants had been delivered, all descended from one man's forbidden experiment. The experts no longer saw Gunn as a troublemaker. They saw him as a pioneer, the man who proved that innovation isn't born in laboratories, but in the hands of those who fight with weapons they must trust with their lives. And because of him, bomber doctrine would never be the same again. Long after the smoke from the Bismarck Sea drifted away, Papy Gun kept pushing. He designed new gun packages. He extended range with improvised fuel systems. He found ways to cool barrels so they wouldn't melt during long bursts. He tuned feed mechanisms to stop jams, rebalanced tails, reinforced skins, and turned every B-25 in the Southwest Pacific into a weapon that terrified anything afloat. But even as he built new tools for the war, his mind stayed thousands of miles away, behind the walls of the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, where his wife and 4 children were starving. The reports arriving from the Philippines grew darker. Food rations had been cut, medicine was gone, prisoners were dying from malnutrition. Rumors spread that the Japanese camp commander had vowed to execute every prisoner if American troops approached the city. Gunn heard all of it. He ignored none of it, and he flew harder than ever. By late 1944, he was running missions almost daily. Gunships hunted, barges, convoys, landing craft, and transports across the archipelago. Japanese commanders stopped sailing by daylight. Then they stopped sailing at night. Then they stopped sailing altogether. When American forces landed at Leyte on October 20th, Gunn could feel the war tilting. The road back to Manila was finally opening. But war has a cruel sense of timing. On November 27th, Japanese bombers struck Tacloban airfield in the early hours of the morning. Gunn was in a tent reviewing mission plans when the first wave hit. Shrapnel tore through the canvas and into his leg and shoulder. Blood soaked his flight suit. Doctors said he needed surgery. He tried to stand and go check on his aircraft. He collapsed before he made it 30 feet. The wounds were serious. They said he wouldn't fly again for months. Maybe longer. Maybe never. But Gunn didn't care about flying. He cared about one thing: getting to Manila. On February 3rd, 1945, American forces fought their way into the city, street by street, house by house, block by block. Buildings collapsed, civilians fled. The sound of war echoed through every alley. And then, After nearly 3 years of captivity, the gates of Santo Tomas opened. Gunn flew to Manila against medical orders. He moved with a cane. His leg was still wrapped in bandages. He looked thin, gray, exhausted, a man who had burned years of his life to reach this moment. His wife didn't recognize him at first. She had lost so much weight, she was barely more than 90 pounds. Their children were shockingly small, pale, frail, fighting illness. Gunn had to say her name before she realized the man standing in front of her was her husband. They held each other for the first time since April 1942. 4 hours later, Gunn returned to duty. The war wasn't over, and he wasn't finished. His gunships continued flying, now under other hands, strafing airfields, sinking ships, wiping out troop columns, burning supply depots, and strangling Japanese logistics across the Philippines and New Guinea. By war's end, the numbers spoke louder than any metal. More than 800 Japanese ships sunk, over 2,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground, an estimated 85,000 enemy soldiers killed by gunship tactics born from his designs. Nearly 5,000 modified B-25s rolled off the assembly line, all descended from Gunn's original field-built prototypes, the very airplanes experts once tried to shut down. After the war, the Army retired him for medical disability. He was just 48. He returned to the Philippines, rebuilt the airline he had founded before the war, and watched it grow across Asia, Australia, and the United States. But the war never really let him go. He flew constantly, as if motion itself kept the ghosts away, the faces of the men who never came home, the missions he couldn't forget, the battles he fought with machines he built by hand. In 1957, Papy Gun died in a plane crash in the Philippines. The government gave him a state funeral. Thousands attended: American veterans, Filipino civilians, airline workers, and former prisoners from Santo Tomas who owed their freedom to the man who refused to let the war break him. Today, the most heavily armed strike aircraft in the U.S. inventory, from the AC-130 gunship to every forward-firing attack plane in the modern arsenal, traces its lineage back to Gunn's impossible idea. A bomber that wasn't supposed to work, a design the experts rejected, a weapon built from scrap metal, battlefield intuition, and stubborn defiance, and a man who fought not for glory, not for rank, but for his family, and changed the course of the Pacific War in the process.